the impact of the Industrial Revolution in liberal Britain, and we saw that the working class were beginning to be organized. We had referred to the Chartist Movement, which witnessed the outlining of the demands of the working class in a charter that they presented to Parliament. Now, if this is how the working class movement started in England, there had been thinkers in England as well as on the continent who were now thinking in terms of a new ideology that might equip the working class to fight better for an improvement of their condition in the context of the Industrial Revolution. Quite plainly, this was germane more to western part of Europe than the whole of Europe. Britain and France in particular displayed the misery of the new working class in the urban areas, especially Paris and London in particular. Paris was particularly believed to have been a city of utter misery and crime. Vidocq, who was an ex-convict himself and later chief of the secret police, indicated the existence of crime. And another report suggested that there had been as many as 60,000 people who were out to wage a war on the state. These poorer people, the working class people, were obviously equated in the eyes of the state with crime and criminality. The novels of Balzac or Victor Hugo, Using the Shoes, Mystère de Paris, are full of such anecdotes and vivid description of the misery of the poorer elements in the society. Now, it was in response to this misery that a new intellectual movement started, to which the name of socialism has been ascribed. The socialists were seized of the problem that the Industrial Revolution had produced in the economic, in the social, and in the political sphere. They were gradually to evolve a theory that would suggest getting away from this misery and to not only improve the lot of the working class people, but indeed to establish them as the ruling class, as it were, in a new situation, in a new social and political and economic organization. It was, to begin with, an intellectual response rather than a mass movement immediately. They drew heavily on their predecessors in the 18th century, though some would say that these utopian ideas can be traced back even to the 16th century. The ideas of Sir Thomas More as enshrined in his Utopia. They were in England during the English Revolution of mid-17th century, the levelers, the diggers, the ranters, who had visualized kind of a communal society which would be distinctly different from the existing organization. Even during the French Revolution, we have Mably and Morelli and their ideas, and later Babeuf's conspiracy of equals, or even Buonarroti, who were later to play a significant role in Italian politics. Now, all these people were particularly concerned with social justice and with equality, the notion of equality. They suggested a gradual transformation of the society, and at a level it is possible to suggest that what they were thinking of was a gradual reform of the existing society, a kind of a change from above. What they expected was a change of heart among those who were primarily responsible for economic and social exploitation, and This would therefore produce the reforms and give a better standard of living to the working class. And therefore, these people have been called utopian socialists. Some of them thought in terms of production, some of them thought in terms of organization, some of them even thought in terms of anarchy. There was a certain lack of systematization, and if there were commonalities as far as social justice or the notion of equality were concerned, they really developed their systems almost as individual models. It was later that Marx and Engels in Germany claimed to have developed what they termed scientific socialism. And it is in course of the 19th century, should we say almost the first half of the 19th century, that the utopian socialism culminated in the scientific socialism of Marx and Engels and produced by the end of the century a very strong socialist movement that claimed to have the new working class as its basic constituency. It all started with the workers' own organization, trade union movements, demand for limited working hours or clearly defined working hours for better wages, better living conditions, etc. Something that can be described as an economic struggle, graduating later onto the political struggle. Socialist ideology at a level was born in France in the first half of the 19th century. The weakness of the working class movement as such produced several doctrines of emancipation. Particularly around the 1830s, you find a convergence between these ideas and the ideas of the Romantics. There was quite a bit of commonality in what these two groups were thinking about and suggesting. They believed that the society tended to be corrupt. They were valorizing passion, which had an ennobling role, and they wanted women's rights. We have to think of Sainte-Beuve, George Sand, Victor Hugo most certainly, and their relationship with men like Lamennais, Saint-Simon, and Pierre. Saint-Simon who had fought in the War of American Independence. Then he bought biens nationaux, that is confiscated property during the revolution, and speculated in this and was ruined. He worked as a clerk, then as a pawnbroker, and he was to develop his ideas that had been labeled sometimes as a part of the utopian socialist doctrines. He wrote a book called De la réorganisation de la société européenne. In this, he conceived a European federation and a parliament of savants and intellectuals, which will draw up the code of general morality and based on freedom and conscience, with institutions and educational system common to various people. After 1815, Saint-Simon gradually turned his attention to the economic questions, explaining, however, production rather than consumption. He wrote a huge 4-volume De l'Industrie. It would be necessary, he said, now to replace the government of men by government of things. He suggested a new technological organization of a society, and he famously said that power should give way to abilities. The philosophy of the 18th century was revolutionary. The philosophy of the new age needs to be organizational. It was necessary to organize. Later, he even started a movement called New Christianity, new kind of a religion that did not believe in miracles and supernatural beliefs. Basically, he was against the exploitation of man by man, and this is what he considered as the real evil. He wanted to put an end to competition by means of exchange or organization of credit and industry, elimination of parasitic idlers, the suppression of inheritance, and sanctification of labor and talent. Again, he said, he put forward a formula that to each according to ability, and to each ability according to work. But this was to lead to a new society. Whether that would be real socialism is another context. But obviously this was too impractical, too unorganized to lead to a systematic thought or even attempt a systematic reorganization of the society. His followers later developed his ideas, Enfantin wrote and put them on a clearer terms particularly. He even later set up a community of love in 1832. It had some impact on Germany on Friedrich List and particularly the poet Heinrich Heine. Later, they also developed a kind of Saint-Simonian commercialism or a commercial Saint-Simonism. He went to Egypt and was the first to talk in terms of a Suez Canal, an idea that became a reality much later, a few decades later, but that he did. And indeed, many of his disciples ultimately invested in railroad, in companies, and they were now concerned more with producing wealth than distributing it. And this first, one of the earliest advocates of kind of socialism was, however, a little too individualistic to have a very broad and wide appeal. Charles Fourier was a humble shop assistant and a dreamer. Fourier wrote a book called Nouveau Mode Industriel in 1820. He was thinking in terms of organizing, provided a new kind of organization. He called it phalansteries. These phalansteries, each unit would consist of 1,620 people, and a network of organization would create a new social networking, and in this, people will be rewarded according to the capital invested, labor spent, and skill employed. And therefore, it would be some kind of an egalitarian society, but that retained its agricultural and even artisanal character. There was Proudhon. Proudhon was an artisan from a peasant stock. That was his social background. He was self-educated, worked as a painter in Lyon and an accountant in Paris, who had a variety of work experience. He wrote in 1840 a tract on property, and he is famous for this statement that all property is theft. So while the French Revolution was predicated on the sacrosanct nature of property, here we now have the early socialists questioning the very sanctity of this property by insinuating that property can only result from exploitation of one by another. He expressed egalitarian principles and was extremely hostile to all agents of authority, the state, the church, the large factories or the large commercial or industrial enterprises. He believed that an exchange and barter should be the basis of economy. He was willing to put the workshop at the central point of the entire social and economic organization. He dreamt indeed of a federation of autonomous communes that would ensure this egalitarian spirit that the artisans and peasants should also enjoy. Pierre Larue, who was a curious mix of socialism and religious sensibility. He published a working class paper called L'Atelier. He relied upon self-sacrifice of the capitalists to produce a republic of God. Again, this was indeed very utopian and was predicated on the change of heart kind of an approach. These men did not appreciate the role of the state in solving the problems and were always thinking in terms of social initiative, individual initiative to produce reforms, to produce change. Louis Blanc, in his L'Organisation du Travail, the organization of work, recognized for the first time that it was for the state to bring about the freedom. If I may quote from him, failing to take power as an instrument is to meet it as an obstacle. The emancipation of the proletariat could not be achieved by isolated partial efforts, but through the omnipotence of the state. Louis Blanc had a great impact. He even wrote a history of the Mountain Party, eulogizing or highlighting the radical phase of the French Revolution. And later on, after the 1848 revolution in France, as we had seen much earlier, Louis Blanc's idea resulted in the organization of the national workshops where people were expected to be given work. There were other important thinkers as well, like Lamennais and Blanqui. Some of them wrote and worked and propagated even as Marx and Engels were developing their own ideas. They had their polemical battle, and out of this was forged the socialist ideas as well as the socialist movement in Europe in the 19th century. In England, we have some people who were called the English Jacobins, for example, John Thelwell, Thomas Spence, or Charles Hall. We have the early ones like William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the famous poet, and his wife Mary Shelley, who was the daughter of William Godwin. They were also, the utopians were thinking of a new society, of a new order. They were deeply influenced by the French Revolution. Now, as E.P. Thompson or Eric Hobsbawm had suggested, in many of these movements, you see the old radical religious sensibilities of the dissenters still having a role to play. So there was a continuity from what was happening or what did happen in England much earlier. Such expressions were seen in the events of Luddism in England in the first decade of the 20th century, where the Greek people broke the machines, etc. William Cobbett was one of the more authentic representatives of the old English radicalism. Robert Owen in England was a manufacturer, a philanthropist. He started his new Lanark Mills when he tried to experiment with a kind of cooperative society. Then you have exchange, you have work vouchers, depending on the work one put in. He also went to America and created his new community of New Harmony, but these did not prove to be very practical applications and were not very successful. What was it? The earlier socialists did not ground themselves on a solid understanding of history and in trying to understand the process of transition to the new order, to the new stage where things are likely to be different. They believe that there are two objective requirements to any development of the theory. First, there is a material prerequisite, and secondly, there are the theoretical sources. The first, that is the material prerequisite, comes from the objective condition created by the Industrial Revolution. The industrial capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the coming of the industrial proletariat, and their miserable living and working condition. And on the other side, there was the need to synthesize the entire intellectual heritage that they had at this point of time. We might just specify a few of them. They indeed synthesized the achievements of German classical philosophy from Kant to Hegel. We know from Hegel they took the dialectical method. Feuerbach, with whom Marx fell out, the materialist interpretation. English political economy, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The utopians, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Proudhon, Robert Wayne, et al. From them, they had to take the idea of abolishing private property, for example. The French historians of the Restoration period, some of them, they received the idea of the class struggle, and 19th century natural science. The dialectics of nature, the cell theory of Schwann and Schleiden, the law of conservation and transformation of energy, and finally Darwin's understanding. The most fundamental achievements in natural science and in historiography were summed up by Marxist philosophy in their understanding of dialectical and historical materialism. Early socialism was restated and revised by Marx and Engels in a way. They did build upon what their predecessors had been talking about. First of all, they talked of economic inequality, and they suggested that economic inequality would be removed in the new society. But this would not mean a mechanically equal income for everyone. What was essential equality, first of all, was the abolition of classes and the establishment of a classless society. Second, in the process of transition from capitalism to socialism, the essential step was the abolition of private property in the means of production at least, and not all private property as such. Thirdly, Marx distinguished between socialism in the first phase and the full-fledged communism which would come at a later stage. It was in the last stage that there would be the application of his famous slogan or formula, from each according to capacity to each according to need. Fourthly, the new society would not come through change of heart, but force, he famously said, is the midwife of a society pregnant with a new one. So change may come through force, through a revolutionary movement. Fifthly, in the struggle for the new society, revolutionary movement would be most effectively led by the proletarian classes, because they had, again in his words, nothing to lose but the chains. One recalls the famous words of the Communist Manifesto: "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Sixthly, class struggle, they argued, was a constant in all societies, and it is the class struggle that leads to the next. Now, in suggesting these basic features of the new society, they also developed the basic tenets of socialist thought. Its basic philosophy was dialectical materialism, and this rejected both philosophical idealism and mechanistic materialism. This is a very important point to remember. Secondly, Marxism had a very distinctive view of history, namely historical materialism. Thirdly, Marxian economics also exposed the nature of capitalist exploitation. Now, there had been exploitation in all forms of society whenever it is a class-based society, class-divided society. And Marx emphasized the contradictions within capitalism, and that this can be done away with. So, it is this on this basis that they elaborated their ideas. It was necessary to have a parliamentary to have a struggle, and Marx and Engels fought their polemical battle with mechanistic materialists on the one hand and the philosophical ideals or the idealists on the other hand. They were against pure parliamentarism, pure economism and emphasized the need to create a revolutionary ambience, a revolutionary movement. And we know it was in 1889 that in Chicago, in the Haymarket incident, the workers demanding an 8-hour day demonstrated and were killed, and it produced the famous May Day, the day of the working class of the world. It was in this fashion that first the ideas were brought forward, the ideas germinated, and at the same time there was praxis or practical attempts to put these ideas into practice, to organize the working class, to first kind of an economic struggle where they would have more of their benefits, a slightly better life, but ultimately created a political struggle of the working class to achieve their goal, ultimate goal. And it was in 1917 that finally a socialist revolution saw the light of day.